Andrzej Dobriansky is the Communications Director of the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America, joining us from New York to discuss this further. And Scott Ritter also joins us. He's a former U.S. Marine Intelligence Officer who joins us from Bethlehem in New York. Welcome to you both. Andrzej, let me first start with you. When you take a look at the way that the U.S. has assisted Ukraine militarily when it comes to this war, it's doing so in spurts, but over now, I think it's over 500 days now that we're looking at the war. Why do you think there's been reluctance in, at the different stages when the disbursement came, in this case in point being the F-16s?
The F-16s are an international logistics issue. It happened with many other countries who volunteered to hand over their airplanes, whether it was their old MiG airplanes or the F-16s, where Ukraine is relieved that finally a resolution has come. Obviously, all of these resolutions, whether it's the Bradley fighting vehicles, whether it's the Abrams tanks, or the dual-purpose munitions that you mentioned earlier, Ukraine would have liked to have these earlier in order to make sure that the Russian invasion had left its territory by this point. That will surely happen by the end of this year, but it's the amount of time that it's taking for all of this disbursement to happen that does annoy people who would like to have this current invasion. You mentioned 500 days, but of course this is just the latest invasion in a 9-year war. So the sooner we get to that resolution, the more munitions are given over to Ukraine, the sooner the counteroffensive can liberate even more territory in Ukraine.
When you say dual-purpose munitions, you mean?
The dual purpose, the DPICMs, the 155 millimeter munitions that are given for the American supplied howitzers. So the dual purpose munitions are the ones that are being sourced out of both American and European warehouses, munitions that are already in supply until the factories that are located in areas such as Scranton, New York, Scranton, Pennsylvania, and Waterville, New York, as well as European munitions manufacturing facilities can resupply Ukraine to the point where we don't have to rely on the dual-purpose munitions.
All right. Well, Scott Ritter, can you please explain to us where we go from the announcement that was made by the U.S. that it had approved, and now at this point I believe it's in Ukraine's hand, these cluster munitions, to the response that the U.S. president said when asked, why are you providing these cluster munitions to Ukraine, of which he said Ukraine has ran out of ammo. Can you explain to us all of that and put it into context for us?
Certainly. The United States, together with its European allies, has committed to provide Ukraine with the resources necessary to support a counteroffensive, but they've not lived up to their promises. Ukraine currently is firing around 7,000 artillery rounds a day. Ukraine believes that this is 1/4 the amount of artillery rounds they should be firing based upon their capacity in terms of number of tubes, but they simply don't have the ammunition. The United States currently produces 75,000 rounds a month. The Ukraine, or I'm sorry, a year, and the Ukrainians would burn through that in 10 days at this route. And the United States has not upped its production, and so Ukraine's in a situation. This was this was something that Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, warned about last fall. He said Ukraine will run out of ammunition this summer. Well, it's summer, and Ukraine's running out of ammunition. And the United States and Europe haven't been able to come up with the resources necessary to change that. So in an act of desperation, because that's what this is, desperation, the United States has agreed to release its war reserve stocks of the M864 dual-purpose improved conventional munitions, basically 155 millimeter artillery shells equipped with cluster bomblets. These weapons are designed to break up large formations of armored vehicles, infantry in the open. The last place that they're going to be have any utility is against a fortified defensive position with overhead coverage on earth, softened by rain, etc. The dud rate is going to be extraordinarily high. The percentage that's cited by the Department of Defense is a percentage that's attained at the Yuma Proving Grounds in Arizona, fired over a flat, very hard earth surface, optimized for the detonation of cluster bomb munitions. That's not where they're going to be fired in Ukraine. These weapons will actually make Ukraine weaker for two reasons. One, there'll be less impact than a conventional high explosive round. They'll have less destructive impact on the Russians. And two, they're going to prompt a Russian countermeasure, which is going to be in the form of improved cluster munitions used by the Russians. The Russians currently have a tenfold superiority in artillery over the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are about to find themselves saturated with cluster bomb units. It's going to result in higher casualty rates on the part of the Ukrainians and less efficiency on the battlefield. A counteroffensive that's already failed will only fail even further.
Andrzej Dobianski.
Well, we know that Ukraine is gaining kilometers of ground a day during this counteroffensive, so it's obvious that one side is liberating more territory. And of course, unfortunately for the aggressor state in the north, their supplies of munitions are bogged down in dealing with state sponsors of terror. So they're reaching out to other countries like North Korea or the small amount of countries that are willing to deal with them, willing to sell them munitions, and that'll prove to be Russia's defeat in the long term.
All right, Scott Ritter, what are we looking at when it comes to this whole operation overall, in terms of the way that, as you mentioned at this point, that Ukraine is on not only a weak footing, but these cluster munitions, as an example, is not going to achieve the desired results against Russia and may bring in an even stronger response from Russia. I'm trying to understand the thinking behind the ones supporting Ukraine in the way that they have, and in terms of the end game. There's also some noise coming that the U.S. May have realized what's happening and may be interested in wanting to wind down this war. But, you know, these are just noises, and they're distorted because we just heard Biden say Russia can't continue this war forever, right? So we're trying to understand where all this stands.
Well, last time I checked, it wasn't Russia running out of ammunition. It was the United States. It's Europe, and it's the Ukrainians. The Russians have sufficient resources. The Russians are dug into defensive positions that are doctrinally laid out. The territory that Ukraine is supposedly advancing on is in what we call the crumple zone. That is the forward area in front of the initial defensive line. There are 3 defensive lines. The Ukrainians haven't even reached the first defensive line, and they've already lost between 20 and 40% of the NATO-trained capability that was being prepared for this counteroffensive. The fact is that the Ukrainians have failed. They will continue to push forward. They will continue to die in outrageous numbers. They will continue to lose equipment. But the Russians are enjoying an 8-to-1 to 10-to-1 kill advantage. That means for every 1 dead Russian, there's 8 to 10 dead Ukrainians. And this is unsustainable, and that's the reality of it. The fact is, if this war continues on this trajectory, Russia will achieve a strategic military victory sometime by the end of summer, early fall. And I think this is the reality that both NATO and the United States are coming to grips with, that they cannot sustain the provision of munitions and equipment to Ukraine necessary for Ukraine to remain viable on the battlefield. Ukraine is losing troops and losing equipment at a rate that far exceeds their ability to replace either. And the Russians, on the other hand, are sitting on reserves that number between 180 and 220,000 strong, reserves that are fresh, well-trained, well-equipped, and when they're committed to the battlefield sometime in the near future, Ukraine will have no response.
Andrzej Dobianski, are you also fighting against what NATO and the U.S. president have come to grips with?
Fighting against what they have come to grips with, I'm not understanding. I know that President Biden said that Russia will run out of munitions before Ukraine because there's such an alliance behind Ukraine. It's impossible that the United States and the West runs out of munitions if they've just decided to hand over these dual-purpose munitions, of which they have somewhere in the hundreds of thousands of millions already in reserve. There are also weapons like ATACMS and others that still have not been given over to Ukraine. So the list of weapons in the West obviously outnumbers what Russia has. What Russia has used against Ukraine are a number of duds. The casual rate is 1/3 of the missiles that they've launched haven't been able to explode on impact. Almost half have not been able to find their targets. And we know even with the so-called new weaponry like the Kinjal weapons used against Ukraine, they are finding themselves useless against Patriot systems that were developed over 40 years ago. So again, time and the alliance will win out over the terrorist state that is Russia. and their kill rate is mostly based on targeting civilians, like a 7-year-old boy who was just killed this week by Russians. It's innocent, defenseless people that they try to kill more than anything.
Well, the part that's interesting here, Scott Ritter, I'm not too sure if you agree or not, is when you take a look back about on the wars that the U.S. has waged, I don't see a win for any of them in recent memory. I mean, if you take a look at the Afghanistan war, I don't think they won that. For sure, they didn't win the war that occurred in Syria. And for all the assistance that they gave to Saudi Arabia in the war on Yemen, that didn't prove to be a success either. So why are people under the impression that, well, maybe this time it's different?
Well, I think the last war that we had a clean win in was the 1991 Gulf War. That's the war that I participated in. I'm not saying we won because I was there. I'm just saying we won. You know, you need to separate two things: the military aspect of conflict and the political aspect of conflict. The United States has not lost a military aspect of conflict. There hasn't been a nation on the planet to date that's been able to defeat the United States in a stand-up battle. We have very highly trained personnel. We have outstanding equipment. We have solid doctrine. The problem is that war is an extension of politics by other means. And when you're fighting on a foreign land without sound justification, when you lack the support of the population that you're on the territory that you're occupying, it becomes politically impossible to sustain the conflict. And so political decisions are made to withdraw, not because of military defeat, but because we're unable to attain a victory. We can't define the terms of victory. And I'm afraid that's what's happening in Ukraine today. We have embraced a regime, the Zelensky regime, that has endorsed the ideology of Stepan Bandera, Nazi ideology that the United States used to fight side by side with their Soviet allies to defeat. Ukraine is a corrupt nation. 60 to 70% of the aid that is provided to Ukraine disappears into this cesspool of corruption. And sooner or later, the American taxpayer is going to get tired of this, and that means that American politicians are going to get tired of it, and a political decision will be made to disengage. But here's the difference. Whereas the United States hasn't lost militarily against an enemy in recent history, this isn't the United States military fighting on the ground in Ukraine. The Russians are defeating the Ukrainian military hands down. There's no amount of spin that you can put on this to change that outcome. Even General Zaluzhny, the commander of Ukrainian forces, recognizes this. The whole world is recognizing this, and this is why I think you're seeing a drift towards a political solution to this problem, because there is no military solution that will come out to the benefit of either NATO, Ukraine, or the United States.
Anders, 2 minutes. Go ahead.
I agree that a country shouldn't fight on a foreign territory where the populace doesn't support them. This is what the aggressor state, the terrorist state, Russia, is doing in Ukraine. They're doing this under false pretenses, a false story of a preemptive war, and this is exactly why they will lose in the end.
All right. Thank you very much. Let me thank Andrzej Dobryansky, Communication Director of the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America. Thank you so much. Scott Ritter, pleasure, former U.S. Marine Intelligence Officer from Bethlehem, New York. Thank you to you both. And with that, we come to an end for this edition of the News Review.